I'm neither an economist or a scholar. I'm just an average American who lost my home and very nearly my family to foreclosure when the market imploded. And I've spent almost every day since trying to find out why. Once the dust settled, it quickly became clear that my story was no different than millions of other Americans. We all thought that we were alone. We all thought that we'd failed. But none of us really knew why.
With a gun in her hand, Addie Polk apparently shot herself in the chest as deputies were knocking on her door with eviction papers in hand.
This dramatic increase in mortgage fraud cases was the canary in the mine. It was the warning.
This was money chasing people. This was not somebody looking for a loan.
It was all designed to maximize profits for all of the different players.
The person who sold you a loan made more money if they sold you a higher rate loan.
They were sold a lie.
They're selling to their very clients these loans that they know are a disaster.
I lost my home not because of money, because of fraud.
I don't believe Addie Polk took out the mortgage on her home. I don't believe she signed any documents.
They just generated all this junk, took home huge bonuses, and then when it collapsed, they said, oh, not us.
This notion that the financial crisis there wasn't fraud and there wasn't crime is absolutely wrong. It's dead.
They were targeting, in many cases, minorities.
We were waiting for the leadership to say, go. That never happened.
The investigation was suppressed.
This was all part of the same puzzle that was falling apart.
This is the largest conspiracy of lies in the history of the world.
This investigation has just begun.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jesse Eisinger. I'm a senior reporter and editor at ProPublica, the nonprofit investigative news organization. And we're gathered here today to discuss Patrick Lovell's powerful documentary, The Con, about the 2008 financial crisis, and talk about the legacy of that crisis today. And we have a panel of some of my friends and experts from across the political world, the financial world, world of journalism, and the worlds of law. And so I think this is going to be a riveting discussion. We will go around the room. Each speaker will introduce him or herself, and then we will have a little bit of a discussion, and then I will open it up for questions from the audience. And I hope you guys bombard us with all of the questions that you have, and we'll try to have a hard stop out at 9 because apparently there's something else coming up that a few people are interested in watching. So today I think we're going to grapple with the legacy of the 2008 financial crisis. 12 years ago, the greatest crisis since the Great Depression, greatest economic and financial crisis since the Great Depression hit this country. It was a once-in-a-lifetime crisis. 12 years later, we have the second once-in-a-lifetime financial and economic crisis of my lifetime upon us. So there are some parallels from then and now. Of course, there was then and there is now a presidential election. There was a Republican in office. The Republican president had led policies that had exacerbated the crisis. Of course, there are great differences now. Then there was an upstart, young, relatively unknown politician who was promising hope and change. And today we have the upstart politician in the office, in the White House, who promised and delivered on a great deal of change, much of it for ill. Instead, we have as challenger, in contrast to 2008, we have a kind of restoration figure, a figure who wants to go back, maybe not just to the Obama years, but even before that, to a period of political comedy. We'll see if that can last or if that works. If Biden actually wins, he may not. What we have today is an economic crisis that's much graver than the financial crisis. Today, we don't have the kind of acute financial crisis that we had in 2008. That crisis was caused by banks, reckless activity from banks. This crisis was caused by a deus ex machina or forces from outside, a terrible pandemic, something that was predictable but not predicted in this form, in this devastating fashion. And the government back then rescued the financial system. The government has again rescued the financial system. The government back then did not actually do much for the economy, for average workers. I consider that one of the great failures of the post-financial crisis period, something we're going to talk about in some depth today. This time, we did bail out average workers and Americans with some extraordinary fiscal stimulus, except that the fiscal stimulus ran out, but the pandemic wasn't finished. And so we are now faced with high unemployment, desperate people, people potentially about to lose their homes, many people out of work today. I think the financial crisis has a great many legacies, and I want to discuss those today. For me, I wrote a book called The Chicken Shit Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. One of the most profound legacies for me was a lack of accountability in the wake of the financial crisis, something that Paul Pelletier, one of our panelists, saw firsthand, and Jen Taub, one of our other panelists, has a book out now today on rampant white-collar failures to prosecute, and she'll talk about that in some great detail. For me, as I say, this was one of the great legacies, a legacy that led to people understanding that the wealthy and powerful could destroy the global economy, get wealthy doing it, and pay no price, not a price with their liberty, and really no social cost as well. And I tried to grapple with that in my book. Another of the great legacies is political. I think the financial crisis contributed to the rise of Donald Trump. I think that's a subject that we can debate tonight. The roots of the Republican victory in 2016 and what Donald Trump's role in that was. I also think that it was before Donald Trump led to what I think of as the most potent social movement of our time, which is not Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street, but the Tea Party, which I think crippled the Obama administration and helped give rise to Trump. So we have better minds than I today on all of these questions. And first I'm going to toss this to Tom Frank for his thoughts. Tom is one of the most important writers and thinkers and observers of the political scene in America today. I've known Tom, at least peripherally, since I wrote for the Baffler back in 1993, I think, about business press releases. That was my first big break. And somehow they allowed that turgid prose in the magazine. That was the high point of my career, I think. It's all been downhill since. Tom, introduce yourself. All the panelists will introduce themselves, and then take it away.
All right. So yeah, Jesse, that's really nice of you. Now, do you want me to actually talk about some aspects of the financial crisis, or just say my name?
That's all you need to do. Let's move on from there. You're a man who needs no introduction. So I would like you to grapple with the legacy of the financial crisis and what kind of role it plays. I think you sent me an email earlier today saying that you thought it was a missed opportunity and a lost moment in history, and I thought you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, the saying that I used to use at the time, or I guess a few years after, once it was clear that you know what our response to it was going to be, I used to say it was America came to the turning point, and we missed the turn. And I should say what for years I have said, and I still, I guess, sort of believe that the financial crisis was the most important event in our stupid century. But what made it so important, and by the way, Jesse, everybody, interrupt me if I talk too much, okay? I have a problem with this. I just run on and on and on. But what was so, what made the global financial crisis the most important event for me was that it shattered the shibboleths of nearly everyone. Okay, think back to the 1990s or the early aughts, when there was this universal bipartisan consensus on markets and deregulation. There was this idea that people had that we had entered this new world in which the market deity made all decisions correctly, that resistance to market forces was futile, that regulation was a relic of a deluded age, that economics was a system of knowledge that stood above and beyond ideology, and there were all of these heroic and even celebrated deregulations from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s up into the aughts, especially deregulations of banking, of the financial industry. And in fact, banking was often described in these days as the great embodiment of this new knowledge, our new understanding of economics. Banking taught us that risk could be minimized, if not deleted from the system altogether. We thought there was something magical about finance, that it was a more noble industry than others, that it fully deserved its rewards. These guys plucking profits from thin air, not polluting, putting the brain power of all those highly educated professionals to good use. And another shibboleth, remember the great God bonus, which I forget who the thinker was now, but told us that the bonus aligned the interests of the CEO with the interests of the shareholder. This was one of the great financial innovations of the 80s and the 90s. And of course, in the financial crisis, it turned out that bonuses actually, what they did, the way they functioned, was to permit those CEOs to loot their companies. And I also think of the great shibboleth of the sort of the conservative approach to government, as perfected under George W. Bush, in which you turned over regulatory agencies to the regulated, or you spoke of the regulated as the customer. You would sabotage things like the Department of Labor or the Securities and Exchange Commission, putting these agencies into reverse. And what this did is it allowed fraud to flower. The government sat on its hands as the predatory lenders fattened all through the run up to the financial crisis, the real estate boom. Here's something that I wrote back at the time. I think I wrote this in 2010 or 2011. If ever a financial order deserved repudiation, this one did. Its gods were false. Its taste was bad. Its heroes were oafs and brutes and thieves and bullies, and all of them failed, even on their own stunted terms. The MBA president, remember how they used to call George Bush the MBA president, and his market-based government, the K Street Project and the super lobbyists who epitomized it, the federal agencies that had learned to think of private industry as their customers, the sleepy regulators ignoring the red telephone ringing in the next room, and our fleet of hedge fund billionaires chortling on their yachts as they all steered toward the iceberg. All of it should, by rights, have met its end. But here's the thing, Jesse, everybody, it didn't. Instead, what happened was the liberals got their turn. Barack Obama came in mid-crisis, and then the liberal shibboleths got destroyed in turn, right? They didn't turn their backs on Bush's bailouts, his cronyism. They continued it. Their love of expertise meant that they could not pull a Franklin Roosevelt to Bush's Herbert Hoover. They were consulting with the same people, the same experts. And every compromise that Obama proceeded to make was a compromise in the direction of Wall Street. And I think often about this liberal trust and faith in experts and educated elites, all the way that these professionals managed to discredit themselves in the financial collapse. The home appraisers the bond rating agencies, the investment bankers defrauding their clients. And then, and Jesse, you're going to talk about this, I'm sure, the Obama Justice Department and their respect for the highly educated, their embarrassing admiration for complexity, and their refusal to prosecute or even to fire these admirable, noble bankers on the grounds that bankers were a sort of higher species of human than everyone else. Their refusal to break up the mega banks. They're incredibly complicated. They love complexity. Their incredibly complicated reform package, which resembled nothing more than their incredibly complicated healthcare project. And all along, with every bailout, public fury and public outrage mounted and mounted and mounted. I mean, the TARP, this was one of those moments that crushes the faith of a nation. Everybody in those days was talking about the return of Depression-era populist outrage. But look at who steps up and takes advantage of it. Glenn Beck, the Tea Party movement, going out there and blaming individual home buyers, right? And this is, by the way, a reaction to the financial crisis that you hear to this day. And what we learned, and this is the ultimate lesson, is the incredible dynamism of the political right, of the conservative movement. When the liberals threw up their hands and said nobody was to blame, the right pounced. The liberals expected history to take its course and give them a Rooseveltian majority. They didn't have to do anything. They're, the usual complacency. The right got off their ass and built a movement, captured the spirit of the age, took it away from Obama. And believe me, did it in the most cynical way. From the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade, for Pete's sake, waving their copies of Ayn Rand in the air, denying that they owed other members of society a damn thing. And remember this last point, that what's the liberal reaction to this? Do you remember this in 2010? The Rally to Restore Sanity. I'm not making that up. That was what it was called, the Million Moderate March. The right is out there saying, let the failures fail. And the liberals are saying, let's listen to the experts. And this has utterly predictable results, with the Republican Party winning this shocking victory in 2010. These people who should have been repudiated for decades, instead they roll right on through the Obama years and then give us Donald Trump in 2016. One last point. I was there at the Republican convention in 2016 when the assembled Republicans mocked Ted Cruz's wife with the shout, Goldman Sachs. These are Republicans mocking a woman because she once worked at Goldman Sachs. And then, of course, once Donald Trump is duly elected and, and situated in the Oval Office, he appoints a banker from Goldman Sachs as his Treasury Secretary. And so, my friends, the disaster is complete.
Excellent, Tom. That's a fantastic and horrifying walk down memory lane, and I remember it well. And I thought the height of brilliance and audacity in the 2016 election was that Donald Trump, this creature of Wall Street, was, and also, of course, the bane of Wall Street because of all of his bankruptcies, ended up running against Wall Street, and Hillary Clinton couldn't counter it because she'd given all those speeches. You mentioned the flowering of fraud. It's a topic near and dear to my heart. It's also near and dear to Jen Taub's heart. I have her new book. All of you should buy it. It's out now, Big Dirty Money. Paul has it as well. It's a great, fantastic read. There we go. So Jen, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about the book, and then kind of talk to us about the legacy of the financial crisis as you see it, please.
Thanks so much, Jesse, and thanks so much for taking us down that bad memory lane, Tom. It made me think that you need to read this book, my first book, which was called Other People's Houses, which does give that history of deregulation that you spoke of. You were kind and spoke a lot about deregulation or the legacy of it during the G.W. Bush administration, but you did leave out that a lot of that happened during Bill Clinton, and then the folks who were brought into the Obama administration, like Robert Rubin, had come from the previous administration who set the stage for the crisis that would follow. What I want to say is that if I'm answering the question, what is the legacy of the financial crisis? I think in one way I was right and one way I was wrong. The way I was wrong is I thought that the connections that were made intellectually, friendships, as well as sort of philosophical and political connections between the progressive left and the right would be maintained, and that there would be the same way in which I was not afraid to criticize some aspects of the Obama administration, even though I'm a Democrat. I thought that all Republicans, when they saw what Donald Trump was doing, would criticize him as well. And what I have come to find out is it's really only the never, so-called never Trumpers who are willing to do that. And it was a great disappointment. It made me very cynical about being willing to criticize members of my own party when they're in office if Trump was going to be the legacy. But I can't help it. I'm going to still be an honest person. But the way in which I think I was right is that the lesson of the global financial crisis, the toxic mortgage-linked meltdown, is that crime is just a cost of doing business for many of these banks. And now that message has been sent to other companies. And I know that's a bit of a cliche, cost of doing business, right? And I think that most people use the term to mean, it's just a tax. It's not that if there's going to be any kind of enforcement, it won't really have deterrent effect. Cost of doing business sometimes means no one's going to jail. All of that is true. But what I mean tonight about cost of doing business is I'm actually talking about a particular cost. So, and let's just look at Citibank. It seems like the cost of white collar crime is $400 million. It always seems to be $400 million. Today in the news, we find out that Citibank was fined $400 million related to internal problems with maybe money laundering concerns. So in this kind of understated comment in the New York Times, Emily, I think her name is Emily Flitter, says the bank has also had trouble keeping track of the flow of illicit funds through its accounts. That's in reference to the almost comical fact that they accidentally sent $1 billion to the wrong people. This brings to mind that banks like Citigroup are too big to manage and not just too big to fail, right? But when I say it's the cost of doing business, $400 million seems like a lot of money to me, maybe to you. It's nothing to Citigroup. And in fact, it's almost like every decade, Citigroup is getting given a slap on the wrist despite the many bailouts. So let's look at this. Back 10 years before the financial crisis, Citibank was caught up in the whole internet brokerage scandal. Some of the folks on this call are old enough, Jesse's just revealed that he is, to remember Jack Grubman, the guy, the analyst at Solomon Smith Barney, who was, jacking up ratings on AT&T to make his boss, Sandy Weil, happy, and in exchange for that, helping to get his two kids into the preschool at 92nd Street Y. And so that fine was $400 million. No inflation on these fines. And see, so $400 million to me seems like a really small number in comparison with the $476 billion, that's billion with a B, that and support and cash and other guarantees that Citigroup received in two separate bailouts, one under Bush in 2008 and one under Obama in 2009. I'm not aware of, and maybe there's some news on this, but I'm not aware of any Citigroup or Citibank executives in any of these major scandals who face prosecution. I'm not suggesting I have evidence that any of them should. But if you have $400 million every, decade, knowing that you have this implicit guarantee that no matter what happens, you're going to be bailed out, I don't see any accountability. And Citi's just one of many examples that I cover in my new book. And I, it's hard to emphasize enough, and I'll stop at this point in a moment. It's hard to emphasize enough the problem with accountability and how it's different from it was before. If you look after the savings and loan crisis, this is something Bill Black talks about a lot. After the savings and loan debacle, we had 1,000 bankers who went to jail. During the Enron accounting fraud era, we had CEOs and CFOs and executives down the line who were investigated, prosecuted, and sent to jail. And that was a Enron task force led by Andrew Weissman. And that didn't happen under the Obama administration. And like Jesse, I think there are a lot of factors that led to, and like Tom, I do think some of the Tea Party movement did arise after Rick Santelli's speech when they wanted to bail out homeowners and not just the banks. I agree that's true, but I think there's another aspect that Jesse's also talked about earlier, which is I think this failure to prosecute white collar criminals also led to Trump's own rise. If you look at his personal history from decade after decade, this is someone who was engaged in activity that ended up settling out, money laundering at his casino when he was there, even though the charges come after. But it's civil money laundering charges or civil RICO cases. There are so many instances where people held back, gave him chance after chance after chance. And I think if he had been held accountable, he would have served time in federal prison and not in the Oval Office.
Thank you, Jen. I completely agree. I think a world where white collar crime was adequately policed and prosecuted is a world where President Trump is an impossibility. Paul, you saw this from the inside, and you were a prosecutor in the Department of Justice, a long-standing prosecutor who's seen many administrations, 7 or 8 different. No, you're a good friend. And 5, unmute yourself because we want to hear you now. And I think what Jen said and what Tom said is both things that you could pick up on and shed light on. One, the lack of accountability and why it happened, and also the kind of elevation of the technocratic Obama people. And I think, and I say this with the greatest praise, you are the anti-technocrat. And so tell us a little bit about who you are and what your experience was, and what the legacy that of the financial crisis is for you today.
Sure, and thank you, Jesse. And I do agree with what Jen said and what Tom said about certain aspects of this crisis. But my perspective is a lot different. My perspective was that of a line prosecutor. I had been in the Department of Justice about 25 years when the financial crisis hit, and I know he didn't say it exactly this way, but some of what Tom said was that the financial crisis sort of broke the psyche of the American people. And I think what broke the psyche of the American people was the fact that it wasn't dealt with appropriately. And quite frankly, from my experience, it broke my psyche as well. And I'll tell you how and why. So the Department of Justice, in my view and in my experience, had always been there when there were great economic crises, when there was some great other crises in the country. The Department of Justice, in my view, had always answered the bell. The civil rights crisis, as Jen talked about, the savings and loan crisis. I was a prosecutor in Miami, remember? And I was a drug prosecutor a long time. The Congress and the Department of Justice really enabled us to prosecute drug cases in an effective way. That was my experience. It's why I joined the Department of Justice. When the savings and loan crisis hit, the Department of Justice put a lot of effort behind it. Regulators, Bill Black talks about this, regulators helped us, and we ended up prosecuting over 1,000 executives, like Jen said. And then I came up to Washington, D.C. in 2002 to prosecute corporate fraud. And as luck would have it, we have the accounting fraud crisis, the Enron crisis. Again, we have the Enron task force in the fraud section. And again, the department's doing what the American people expected to do, prosecuting executives, putting them in jail, and giving people in America confidence that at least when people stray from crime, white-collar people, there's going to be a penalty to pay. And it's not perfect, and it's not always easy, but it's a recipe that's not that difficult. We had the recipe. We had the recipe, the strike force, the bank fraud task force in the late 70s. We prosecuted, like I said, over 1,000. We had the recipe in the late 90s and early 2000s. the Enron or accounting fraud, corporate fraud strike force, prosecute 850 people. It's what we do at the Department of Justice is not put men on the moon. We prosecute people. And as you said, Jesse, in 2009, we all knew that this new administration was coming in. When they were coming in, they knew there was a financial crisis. It took them almost a year to create a task force to deal with it. Almost a year. How is that possible? We're itching to prosecute these cases, but they can't get their act together to do it. Number one. Number two, so I think it's a failure of competence. I don't believe that they had the competence to do it. There was a roadmap. We just had to follow it. It would have got done. We didn't do it because they didn't have the competence. What else didn't they have? They didn't have ultimately they didn't have the courage to do it, but they also didn't know how to actually do some of these things. And what do I want to say? They didn't have the commitment. So, and I'll give you one or two examples, then I'll walk away and we can talk about this in detail. And I think that this is a good place for the con. But as I said, the competence, they didn't have the competence to do it. Prosecuting cases is simply, particularly white collar cases, is simply figuring out where they're lying, where they're cheating, where they're deceiving, and prosecuting that. And it's never changed. That's what we do as prosecutors. And it's a pretty simple formula. I'm not saying it's easy to put these cases together and do it, but it's a pretty simple formula. And commitment. Remember, in 2009, the SEC went after Mozilla and Countrywide, and they filed a complaint. And anybody who can read that complaint will know that Countrywide was a cesspool of fraud. It was a cesspool of fraud. The SEC settled with them, and within literally, I want to say 10 weeks, the Department of Justice stated publicly that they weren't going to pursue him criminally. That can't happen in a normal world, but that happened with this Department of Justice. And every one of us who's a white-collar prosecutor saw that, and we couldn't make sense of it other than these people are not committed to do this. And then finally, I just want to say courage. They didn't have the courage to do it. When I say the courage, I mean, when I tried to prosecute, I investigated AIG and I tried to prosecute Joe Cassano, the CEO of AIG. And I consistently was told by my boss, Lanny Brewer, that if you cannot guarantee me a victory, we're not going to allow you to prosecute this case. And that is absurd. I'd never heard that in my 25 years in the Department of Justice. It is absolutely absurd. So what happened? So we have tens of millions of Americans losing their jobs, losing their retirement savings, losing their homes, and mostly affecting lower class, middle class, and lower status, lower economic status people. They saw the bailouts. Nobody bailed them out. They saw the bonuses that these people were still taking. Nobody gave them a bonus. Their kids still weren't able to go to college. Some of them, they didn't have a house. And this continued through all 8 years of the Obama administration. So at the end of the day, people looked to the Department of Justice to do one thing: prosecute somebody. Please just prosecute somebody. And the department failed on every level. They prosecuted nobody. So when people say, why are we here today? Why is Trump president? Well, I'm just telling you, there's a lot of people who believed, that had their back broken, had their psyche broken. They believed that the government wasn't working for them. And I believe it had a huge impact on both voter turnout, and people's just wanted to elect someone who would break things because government wasn't working for them. And so that's how I think the legacy is. That's why we're where we are today.
Thanks, Paul. And I agree that they wanted to elect somebody who wanted to break things, and they've gotten their wish. Maybe in ways that they couldn't imagine. But one thing that appears not to be broken and appears to have been stabilized in the wake of the financial crisis, at least that's the one version of this story, is the financial system, and more specifically, the banking system. Myra, you have a unique window into the modern capital markets. You have now seen multiple bailouts of those markets, most recently in the spring, where the Fed engaged in extraordinary and unprecedented actions to intervene in the markets, buying corporate bonds, even junk bonds, and bailing out the markets yet again. And I wonder if you could help us understand, from your perspective, did we fix the financial system? If we fix the financial system, why did it need to be bailed out again? And what's the financial system that we have today, and how fragile and concerned are you?
Yes, thank you. I think it's an excellent question, Jesse, and you really point to an absolutely critical aspect of the financial crisis, the legacy, and there were both good and bad things that came from it. So after the financial crisis, there were some really key provisions that came out to protect consumers, which I thought was really unbelievably important and incredible, because the reason that I am very frustrated with banking crisis is because, the banks do not invite ordinary people to come to their champagne parties. And yet, when there's losses, there's nobody better at socialism than banks, socializing the losses, but of course, privatizing the gains. And so under the Obama administration, specifically under the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, known as Dodd-Frank, there was a creation of the Financial Systemic Oversight Council, which for the first time in American history, if you can believe it, was going to be a regulator designated to find where's the next crisis coming from. Is it from banks? Is it from hedge funds? Where's it coming from? And in addition, that law gave us the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was the brainchild of then Professor, now Senator Elizabeth Warren. And these two institutions were really unprecedented steps to try to protect Americans from financial predators and miscreants. And there were also a whole host of capital liquidity, leverage rules that were really important to try to make banks safer. Safer for whom? For the depositors. In other words, ordinary people that are not part of the financial system. And so I was very excited when these things were coming about, but very quickly, a couple of things worried me. First, there was really lack of cognizant diversity. The same kinds of people that had been involved in the lead up to the crisis were now being hired to be part of the solution. So I found this very, very strange. There were barely any women other than Sheila Bair who were being brought to key positions to find solutions to the crisis. Forget people of color. And so I thought, wait a minute, clearly the run-up should have given us some lessons that we need cognizant diversity. The other thing that I didn't see, unfortunately, was that we still have a very fragmented regulatory framework. Tom mentioned, the sleepy regulator. Sure, like everybody else, there's imperfections everywhere. But most of the regulators, and I'm talking about bank, the Fed, FDIC, OCC, for the most part, most of these people, I've been working with them for, 20 some odd years in my consulting and training practice. And they actually really do believe in the safety and soundness of a banking system for the purpose of protecting, the American depositor. They're not there to be consultants or cheerleaders. Now, unfortunately, the OCC did have problems. I thought that they had been resolved, and now we're back to sort of being, seeing very industry-friendly regulators occasionally. And the other thing that continues to worry me, other than that lack of cognizant diversity and a very fragmented regulatory system, is that Fed, FDIC, OCC are only in charge of banks. So no one's in charge of private equity. No one's really in charge of hedge funds. And so here we are a decade later, and unfortunately, the Trump administration has really gutted the Financial Stability Oversight Council and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So these were two key regulators that were supposed to be there to help Americans. Also, importantly, what's happened now over decades of low interest rates, but also lack of regulatory and political will, we're now in a situation where American companies are at historical levels of indebtedness, 5, 6 times, greater than their earnings. Why do I care about that? Because again, banks, are in a hurry and have let go of their due diligence when it comes to lending to companies. These loans are typically known as leveraged loans. Those loans are then packaged into collateralized loan obligations. What does that mean? Why does that matter to you and me? Because basically the banks are transferring the risk, their risk, to pension funds, to asset managers, to people like you and me who have, 401k plans. So anybody who has a bond fund actually has CLOs and these other kinds of opaque, relatively illiquid securitizations. And so now that we are in the severity of the COVID crisis, we've had rising default rates. We've got companies that are struggling to make ends in terms of paying their debt. So what are they doing? They're laying off millions of Americans, right? You've had a rise in bankruptcies. So yet again, those very Americans who had barely recovered from the financial crisis are now the ones that are the most vulnerable. And so where you had toxic subprime loans, some were fraudulent, some were basically, underwritten because of greed, some was poor, controls, poor data, as we still see in Citibank's the settlement today. They're still having problems with data and technological issues. And now, as opposed to the subprime loans, what I think we really should be worried about is just the excessive amount of loans from these corporations. They're starting to default on their loans. They're going to be firing more people. And what that means is that, unfortunately, it continues to widen the income and wealth inequality in this country that really was triggered due to the financial crisis. It was in the running before, but the financial crisis exacerbated. And that widening income and wealth inequality, particularly when we talk about the racial one, is really what we have to grapple with. And unfortunately, because of the last couple of years, with Trump really allowing bank lobbyists and other kinds of interest, to really run the show, we're back to an environment where a lot of those good regulations that came under Dodd-Frank have really been watered down. And so, unfortunately, I feel like we're back again, to sort of, 2009, 2010 again. And there's just so much at stake right now. And I just really worry that yet again, ordinary Americans are going to be hurt by this lack of political will to look after them first, rather than bailing out banks, not to mention unregulated entities like private equity.
Thank you, Maida. That was very worrisome, but insightful. I think you're right that we're facing an increasingly worrisome picture. Bill, you are, to my mind, one of the, if not the premier business and financial reporters of our time. You also are a traitor to your class, having been a refugee from, come over from the taking a vow of poverty to join the Scrivener class from being an investment banker. And how do you see the financial and political worlds as we come up on what I think of as the most consequential election of my lifetimes? Of course, I've only been alive since 2008, Jen, so you got that wrong. This is really only the third or fourth presidential election I've seen because I'm so young. Bill, why don't you bring us home, and then we'll open it up for a little bit of question and Q&A.
Well, Jesse, thank you for that very kind introduction. And let me say it's an honor to have you as a moderator. It's an honor to be with this incredible panel. Very hard to follow any and all of you. Tom Frank should have his own radio show, at least. If he doesn't already, he probably does. I just don't know about it. I mean, that was incredibly eloquent. All of you were so eloquent, and it's a pleasure to be here. There's so many different ways, Jesse, to answer the question that you just asked. And I made notes along the way here, but I think, what stands out for me in this discussion really, and what really hurts me to the core, and I think the symbol of when all went wrong here is our friend Jesse, and I hope you'll agree with me, Preet Bharara. I mean, Preet was the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. premier U.S. attorneyship in the country. No offense, Paul, and responsible for holding people on Wall Street accountable for their bad behavior. So what does Preet do? Preet, of course, doesn't do any of that. What Preet focuses on during his tenure is the low-hanging fruit of insider trading, among hedge fund managers. And, nobody can fault him for that because, of course, that's a very important thing, and nobody likes insider trading. But when you juxtapose sort of insider trading versus huge fraud that was revealed by the very, very courageous and gutsy whistleblowers that are featured in the con, people like Michael Winston and Richard Bowen. I have incredible respect for these individuals, and there are others too, some of whom were not featured in this film, who, risked it all, literally risked their entire careers to come forward and to try to expose wrongdoing and bring forth wrongdoing. And I've spent a lot of time talking to Dick Bowen. He's an incredible guy, and the things that he tried to do and bring to the attention of the U.S. attorneys' offices across this country. And you point this out, Jesse, in the Chicken Shit Club, which is an incredible book that everybody should read if they haven't. Just the Eric Holder memorandum, the memorandum that came from the top, that literally dictated the fact that in a post Enron, post Arthur Anderson world, we weren't going to prosecute this white collar crime. And so that's essentially what happened. So the whistleblowers put their careers on the line. They saw wrongdoing as it was happening. They reported it up the chain of command. They lost their jobs. Dick Bowen lost his job because Bob Rubin, the former august Secretary of the Treasury, the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, the advisor to Centerview Partners, the most august consigliere in the Democratic Party, basically covered up the wrongdoing that Dick Bowen revealed. And of course, Preet Bharara just focuses on the low-hanging fruit of insider trading, misses entirely the need to prosecute the crimes that were committed, that the whistleblowers exposed on Wall Street, and then somehow turns that incredible mistake, that incredible failure, into martyrdom when he thinks that somehow, unlike every other U.S. attorney across the country, when there's a new president, especially when there's a change of administration and change of party, that somehow he can stay on, because that's his dream, to stay on, and he becomes a martyr for claiming that Donald Trump, believe me, who I have absolutely no truck for whatsoever, but for Preet Bharara to turn himself into a martyr and a podcaster, and now have the #1 show podcast in New York State, and somebody who's supposed to be somebody we listen to on Twitter and in social media, I just think is unfortunately emblematic and symbolic of the problem that we are faced here. And there are so many ways I could continue to talk about this, but I'm going to stop there because let's try to get in some questions if there are any, and I'm happy to talk about other things too. But.
I'm glad you finished up with that about Preet. I do think that the redemptive power of Donald Trump is one of the most underrated aspects of his presidency. He has rehabilitated the reputation of not only Preet, but Eric Holder, Neil Katyal, 100 other Twitter resistance figures, and even George Bush. Everybody is longing for the glory days of the Bush II administration for its sanity and stability. Never mind, Gonzalez and 1,000 other scandals. And deprivations. So let's take off from that. I want to hear from you guys. I want to do something kind of that will make everybody feel a little foolish. I want you to predict the results of the election, and then very quickly, and then explain whether we have a chance, if it is a Biden administration, to have some kind of momentum for some kind of democratic or populist or anti-corporate or white collar accountability change in society. Tom, you're on the clock. We only have 7 minutes left. But
okay, I can do that real fast.
Yeah.
I think Biden will probably win just because the polls say so, and the fundamentals are so bad for Trump. I mean, come on, you don't bungle a pandemic like this and get reelected. I don't think that but then counting on Biden to do the right thing just because history is pushing him. That's what I thought Obama was going to do in 2009. I had met Obama. He'd been a professor at University of Chicago. And I thought, this is a great man, a great genius, called forth by history at exactly the right moment. And he used all his brilliance and all his genius to avoid doing what he had to do. And that's, these people will disappoint you every time, unless, if you're counting on history to force their hand. It never happens.
Jen, do you think that Biden is going to win? I know we don't want to put the kind of horror on this, and do you think that Biden is a free man with nothing else to lose and no future, and might be able to turn against his forebears, or do you think he'll be captured by it, as Tom said?
So I think Biden will win the popular vote. I think we are going to be fighting all through the courts on the Electoral College. And I think if you think things look bad now, I think the interregnum, I can't say it's going to be a chicken shit show. How's that? I do not look forward to what's to come, and I cannot predict it. I don't think we have any idea of what will come. But assuming Biden wins, which seems probable, but who knows, the Electoral College, I think there's a way to push. And it just depends on who, personnel is policy. I'll know the minute I find out who his Treasury Secretary is, who does he choose for Attorney General. And if they're not people who want to make change, I'm going to keep shouting as best I can from the sidelines. But that's where we are.
And Paul, your prediction, and specifically the DOJ, because the vice president is the perfect emblem of the technocratic careerist, protective of her reputation, chicken shit, to use a phrase, prosecutor. Do we get a different DOJ in a Biden-Harris administration if we do get that administration? You're muted again.
I'm an eternal optimist, and I'm going to tell you that if Biden gets elected, then my sense is that the Senate will become Democratic as well, and I think the House will remain Democratic. If that's the case, there is going to be sufficient synergy to back political will to get things done, and I have faith that with all that we've seen in this administration, the lack of law and order, the reports from the ICIJ recently about FinCEN being unable to get banks to actually stop laundering these trillions of dollars of corrupt money overseas. I think there's so much out there that is an impetus for these people to get their act together and run a Department of Justice correctly. I have confidence and hope that it will be done, and I am an optimist, and I'm happy to play a part and help making that happen. But it needs to happen. It must happen, or in 4 years we're going to be back in the same place we started.
And Maida, the Biden administration, should it be victorious, will inherit, as you were kind of hinting at, an economic crisis and a burgeoning a burgeoning financial crisis, with private equity and commercial real estate crashing, and a desiccated regulatory structure that has been given over to the kakistocracy, the lobbyists. So what do you see for hopes for regulation and regulatory change and corralling big finance?
I am cautiously optimistic that Biden will win, and I'm really doing my best to deliver South Texas, where I'm originally from. I don't know that I can guarantee it. I am trying. I think that if he wins, what I'm really going to be looking for is he really going to be open to ideas from Senator Elizabeth Warren, from Bernie Sanders, Sherrod Brown, who are key, serious financial reformers. And I'm going to be looking to see if he's going to be listening to, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is he listening to Representative Chuy Garcia from Chicago. These are just a few of the representatives and senators who are really essential to getting legislation passed, such as the Stop the Wall Street Looting Act. And so that if I really see some cognizant diversity and I see these people being put in key positions, I agree with Jennifer. I'm going to be looking to see who's Secretary of Treasury. That's going to tell me a lot, because that's the Secretary of the Treasury is the one who heads Financial Stability Oversight Council. I'm going to want to see whom he appoints to head the Fed, the OCC, the FDIC. If those tend to be some of the same and I'm not seeing cognizant diversity, I'm not seeing serious efforts to treat banking and financial regulation as absolutely the cornerstone of turning around the economy and avoiding a financial crisis, then I'm afraid we are going to be, in really deep trouble. But I'm going to keep my fingers crossed and be cautiously optimistic.
All right, Bill, you've got the last word here. It's 9 o'clock. We don't want to take our viewers too past our deadline. Close us off here.
Well, I mean, I'm a little concerned that it's going to be, this panel has agreed it's a sweep for Biden. I certainly agree that Biden is going to win. He deserves to win. We've got to get rid of this monster in the White House. I don't think it's going to be close either in the Electoral College, Jen. I could be wrong, but I think that people have had enough of this ogre. As far as financial reform, I think it's going to be way down the list, quite frankly. I think healthcare is going to be up on the list. Income inequality, getting the economy running again. Tax reform. I mean, got to get rid of this ridiculous corporate tax rate reduction that Trump put in his tax bill. I think reforming Wall Street is just going to be low down the list. On the other hand, if he puts Elizabeth Warren as Treasury Secretary, which I think is a real long shot, but if he were, then the calculus would begin to change. The Fed needs to get back to a normalized interest rate environment, and that's hugely important to quell the risk-taking that's been going on that's been absurd.
All right. Thank you to all the panelists. It's been great. To the viewers out there, watch the con. Buy all of Tom Frank's books, many books. Buy all of Bill Cohan's many books. Buy Jen Taub's many books. And as I say to everyone I meet on the street, like the ancient mariner, buy my book. You don't have to read my book, just buy my book. And thank you all for your insights, and thank you for watching.
Thank you, Jesse. Great moderator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Great work.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Good evening.
Bye.